Hello everybody, this is Count Hammer VHS. Welcome back to the channel. And today, once again, we are taking a look at a mod for Rome Total War Barbarian Invasion. This is the Wainrider preview campaign that I have been cooking up over the past several months. This is a preview of the larger full map campaign known as Total War Wainriders. That's a mod that we've been working on for Rome Total War's Alexander expansion for several years now, and I've put together this preview campaign as a way of showing off some of the units, as a way of getting this out into people's hands while we wait for the fuller mod to be completed, because it will be a while for that to wrap up and get all this stuff implemented and tested and everything. So this mod is again intended as a sort of a shorter, simpler, truncated version of that larger mod, but does allow you to play around with the units and some of the factions in this smaller environment. Today I want to focus on Umbar. This is one of the factions that you'll be playing in the preview campaign as well as in the full mod for Total War Wainriders, and it's a very interesting faction, and you are catching them actually at a very interesting point in their history. So I want this video to be a bit of a lore ramble, as well as a discussion of how we are theorizing this faction in terms of implementing it into the full mod for Wainriders, and also some things that I've done because the preview campaign uses some different mechanics. It's certainly going to be less complex than the full campaign, and it does have its own little quirks, so I wanted to talk about those today. So first, historically, we should acknowledge that that the preview campaign here is set in 1856. So that's a significant date in terms of the Wainrider Wars. This is the year that saw the Battle of the Plains, so somewhere south of Mirkwood, where King Narmakil II of Gondor was defeated and himself killed by the Wainriders of Rovanion, which are represented in this mod by the Western Horde faction. So this is the sort of opening event of the Wainrider conflict, at least as far as Gondor is concerned. It's the opening climactic blow that's going to indicate this is going to be a longer struggle and a harder struggle than they may have anticipated. With regard to Umbar, this date is an interesting point in their history because only 46 years prior, in the year 1810, Umbar itself had been essentially sacked by King Telumetar of Gondor, who later took the name Umbardakill, or Umbar Victor. Umbardakill is an interesting title. It follows the same pattern as other names like Romendakill, East Victor, and Hyar Mendakill, South Victor. And the fact that Umbardakill is a much more modest title than those is itself interesting, because of course East Victor could apply to any number of people in the East. South Victor similarly seems to encompass a vast area, right? This is a very these are very pompous, large claims being made by the kings. And in the cases in which those names are taken, they are mostly, I would say, somewhat justified in the scope that they are claiming for themselves. With Umbardakill, it's a much more modest claim, right? It's victory over Umbar. Why is that so significant, right? I think there are only 3 such titles that occur in Gondor's history that are given to a king: Romendakill, Hyar Mendakill, and Umbardakill. So why is Umbar so significant? Well, at the time that Umbar is taken, that King Telumetar sails a fleet down, presumably, and takes Umbar, and he seems to not simply take it, it seems rather destructive. But at that time, Umbar had been a thorn in Gondor's side for something like 4 centuries. This dates back to the Kin strife, but has roots much, much farther back. Going back to Númenórean times, Umbar almost is there from the very beginning as one of the first, if not the first, established strongholds of the Númenóreans on the shores of Middle-earth. And it has something of a dark history, it has to be said. You always think of Umbar when you're reading about how the kings of Númenor began to mistreat the inhabitants of Middle-earth. They began to use them or to come to them not as teachers, but as lords, right? Taking them as slaves, fighting wars against them, even at the height of their, folly, sacrificing them to Sauron in the Great Temple on the Meneltarma itself. So this is something of a dark moment, you could say, in Numenor's history. Umbar seems to be there through all of that. And of course, most significantly, in the lead up to that, the sort of disaster, the loss of Numenor, Umbar became a stronghold of the King's Men, right? One of the two factions that were essentially warring for the culture and the spirit, if you will, of Numenor. You've got the King's Men who are loyal to the king, right, as opposed to the faithful who are loyal more to the Valar, to the Eldar. Essentially rebels, right? Like, if we want to look at it like that from the king's point of view. But of course, from the faithful, that's where we get Elendil and Isildur and Arion and so on. The stronghold of the King's Men is Umbar. The stronghold of the faithful, or at least the main one, seems to be Pelargir. So there always seems to be this tension between north and south, if you will, at least as depicted on the maps of Middle-earth as we know them. We are told that Umbar was only the nearest of their realms. This is mentioned in the Two Towers. I think Damrod is one of the two rangers who accompany Faramir. And when he's describing the Haradrim to Frodo and Sam, he talks about Umbar being the nearest of their realms, there being the people of Harad, or the south. It's an interesting claim for a man to make, a man of Gondor, in the very end of the Third Age, and it suggests that at that time the people of Umbar were viewed as just another Southron group, as you could well imagine, because by that time, which is of course well after the time frame of this mod, by the end of the Third Age, Umbar had really evidently ceased to have any Dunedainic elements that were at least recognizable, right? Damrod, if that's his name, if I'm remembering that right, Damrod sees essentially no kinship between his people, the people of Gondor, and the people of Umbar. It was very different at the time that we're looking at here in the Wainrider period, because Umbar was and had been not simply another group of Southrons, but the locus of resistance to the King of Gondor. And this, of course, goes back in some ways to the Kinstrife, but most recently, in the memories of Gondor, this would have been starkly illustrated by the fallout of the Kinstrife. So the Kinstrife, of course, to go into that very quickly, and this is all listed in Appendix A, is a very, very readable appendix. If you, of course, haven't read it, I imagine most of my listeners have, but Appendix A at the end of The Return of the King has a sort of a wonderful summary of these events. Very readable, very interesting for the look it gives us of this little-known period in history. But the Kinstrife, and I'm not looking at anything here, so I don't have my dates in front of me, but I want to say 1400s of the Third Age. At any rate, this is when we have Eldacar, who is essentially the heir to the King of Gondor, but there's a problem with him, and the problem is that he is half Northman, right? He has his mother is from Rovanion. She's from the people of the Northmen of Rovanion, who are descended from King Vidugavia, right? Or maybe we could put king in scare quotes, as it so often appears in the various texts that we encounter it. But Vidugavia is by all accounts a very prominent Northman at various times in Rovanian's history, and certainly commands large swaths of territory. Eldacar can claim him as an ancestor. The problem, of course, is that never before has any king of Gondor been anything other than Numenorian/Gondorian blood, right? And we don't know too many details. We don't know the origins of every king and his wife and exactly their family trees, but we can safely say that this is a big departure. And we are told that even before Eldacar's father dies, there was rebellion in the southern provinces. The southern provinces at that time would have included this territory between the rivers Poros and Harnen, so the area that is essentially Harandor, as you may know it from the map. This was part of Gondor at that time, and territories further south as well. Umbar was also part of Gondor at that time. Well, the rebellion eventually coalesces around the figure of Castamir. Now, Castamir, you can look at him as a usurper, and of course, in one sense he is, but there is also an air of legitimacy about him in the sense that he too is descended from the royal house. He's not just some random guy from nowhere. He is one of no doubt many legitimate, in some sense, claimant for the throne of Gondor. And again, I'm not getting into the primogeniture and all the details of how Gondorian rule passes. But the point that I'm trying to make is Castamir is a member of that royal house. And although the kin strife, the civil war that follows, does end with Castamir's death, he does hold the throne for a decade. Right? He does rule in Osgiliath. Although I don't know that he actually spends much time there. He is very much associated with the south, with the coast, and so he wants to move the king's seat to Pelargir rather than at Osgiliath. He was not a big fan of the inland regions. He liked the sea, and he had a lot of strength and support, one can assume, from the men of the coasts and from the men in the south more generally. The thing that's so interesting about that to me is that the rebellion itself seems triggered by the fact that Eldacar is half Northman, right? He has this sort of outsider element in his very blood. But that did not bother the men in the south, right? Who themselves must have mingled with local, people, indigenous peoples of Harad for centuries by that time. We hear about the Black Númenóreans doing the same thing. That very quickly they were intermarried with women of the Harad, and although this contributed evidently, according to the chronicles that we have, to their the dwindling of their bloodline, there does not seem to have been this air of superiority about it. The air of superiority seems to be against Northmen in particular. So one gets the sense that the South was not viewed as other necessarily, certainly by the men of Gondor and Dunedainic descent who lived there, right? Even including the men of Gondor, they would have seen the South, Harandor. This is just part of their realm, and just as there were indigenous people in Gondor proper that we know from the area of the Lord of the Rings, right? So essentially the area west of the Anduin, right? Just as that area was occupied by indigenous people, the men of the mountains, these are the what Faramir will later call the hardy mountaineers of arid Nimraeus, right? These are just indigenous people. These are not folk from Númenor. These are just the same guys who've always been living around the White Mountains. They can be assimilated, according to Faramir. The men of the south can be assimilated even by the Black Númenóreans, who we would assume are evil and bad, right? Obviously they are, but we would associate that badness with racial prejudice that does not actually seem to be present. So whatever we can say about the Black Númenóreans, human sacrifice, worshipping of Sauron, at least they were not racist, right? We can seem to establish that. However, they are having this racial animus against Northmen, which I find fascinating. And it may have been due to the fact that Northmen were not consistent in their support of Gondor. There is this tradition of, and it's very subtle, right? I think we hear Faramir mention it again in the Two Towers when he talks about the Northmen sometimes fighting with men of Gondor. The fact that the Argonath exist right here with their palms pointed outward in token of warning, pointed north, that is. Who are they warning? They're not warning the elves. They're warning Northmen. Those are the people who live there. They're not warning Easterlings. They're warning Northmen. The fact that the second Romendikil, I think it was, in the 1240s, conducted a campaign that reached the shores of the Sea of Rune and perhaps even went all the way around it. sacked Easterling settlements and camps wherever he could find them, associated with Vidugavia on that campaign. But that campaign was not only initiated by Easterlings, it was initiated by the fact that many Northmen at that time were sort of throwing in their lot with Easterlings. So all of these things combine to show that the Northmen, for many centuries, were neighbors, sometimes friends, sometimes allies, but very questionable against the people of Gondor. And the folk of Gondor seem to have viewed them as less civilized, right? That seems to be a big sticking point. So at any rate, Castamir is the king for a decade until Eldacar returns from his exile in Rovanion with a large army. He gets a lot of support in Calenardon. He gets a lot of support in Ithilien, as one would expect. A lot of people around Osgiliath and Minas Anor did not approve of Castamir moving the king's seat south to Pelargir. That was a big problem for them. No doubt you could attribute this to the loss of influence among nobles who had estates, right? Probably lands, power centers in that northern cluster of prominent Gondorian settlements, right? The ancient strongholds, Minas Anor, Minas Ithil, Osgiliath. These are like the centers of the realm, the heart of the realm of Gondor, really. And Castamir says, no, I want to move the king's seat down to the south. Maybe this is an arbitrary decision. Maybe he simply wanted to be closer to his power centers. But it certainly moves the center of gravity, or threatens to move the center of gravity southward in a way that the old guard of Gondor cannot accept. So when Eldacar returns out of the north with his army of Rovanion, his no doubt many horsemen, and he hounds Castamir to the crossings of Arrowy, not too far south of Minas Anor. He slays him in that battle, defeats his army. Castamir's sons, however, escape to Pelargir, and they have a lot of men. They actually hold out for a long time in a siege here against Eldacar, and gather their strength, get presumably a lot of ships as well, and then sail south to establish themselves at Umbar. So now here we are back at the point of this video. So that becomes, we are told, a stronghold, a place of refuge for the enemies of the king for many centuries thereafter. So for a period of at least 400 years, Umbar is the place to go. If you are maybe unhappy with your position in Gondor, if you don't feel like you're being rewarded well enough by the king, or if you're worried that the king might be becoming suspicious of you unfairly, you have a place to go now. You have a place to go in Umbar. You can have a home down there. You can go make yourself useful to this rebellion. But maybe rebellion is not exactly the right word for it, right? We could see that Umbar does, again, have a long history of association with Gondor, going all the way back to King Taranon Falastur, the Lord of Coasts, in I think the 900s of the Third Age, and his his queen Beruthiel, who was evidently from Umbar. Tolkien says she was a black Númenórean, and he packs her south, sends her south on a ship back to or past Umbar. But at that time, Umbar was part of Gondor again, and so Umbar, when Castamir's sons set up shop there, ceases to be part of the realm, right? That does not get back into the hands of Gondor until the year 1810. And in the intervening centuries, there is lots of war and conflict and raids that take place. Most dramatically, I believe just prior to the outbreak of the plague in the 1630s, there is a raid by a couple of Castamir's heirs, which they learn that the king of Gondor, the current king at that time, is in Pelargir with not a lot of men about him, and so they do this smash and grab raid into Pelargir, kill the king, and then retreat. So there is a lot of conflict. This is no doubt the time frame in which Harondor is devastated, right? This is the period when Harondor becomes a desolate place between the Corsairs and the kings. So Umbar is a stronghold. It's a place where there is some legitimacy, because not only do we have Castamir's heirs, who Castamir himself, again, a member of the royal house, sat on the throne of Gondor for 10 years, right? There is some legitimacy there that they can cling to. Castamir's heirs would be of that same family line, And we're told again that rebels of the king would come to swell the forces at Umbar as well. And they no doubt would have brought other members of the royal household and other branches of the nobility. So there's a way in which we can see Umbar as not just sort of a rebel stronghold, but as a separate line, right? A separate legitimate grouping, essentially, of Gondor's nobility. That all may come to an end in the year 1810, when finally Telumetar Umbardakil sends out his expedition. And the impression we get, again, is of Umbar itself being largely destroyed. Now, there is much that we would like to know about that campaign, and especially about its aftermath. We're told that the last descendants of Castamir were killed, but we are not told much else. We're not told about, for example, does Gondor occupy Umbar, or do they just burn it and sail away? It seems that they occupy it for some time, but we're not told exactly in what capacity, right? Is there a skeleton garrison here? Is this really resettled? To what extent is it integrated into the realm? We're told that soon thereafter it falls back into the hands of men of the Harad. So how soon, right? Are we talking 10 years, 50 years, 100 years? Soon is somewhat difficult to measure when we're talking about Dunedainic lifespans. So there's a lot that's uncertain around this period. Another clue that we have, though, or a piece of evidence that we might try to interpret, is in the context of the much later wars of the Wainriders. So again, 1810, Umbar has fallen to the Corsairs. It is back in the hands of Gondor now. But in the lead up to 1944, so about 130 years later, we are told that in the invasion of Gondor from the south by men of the Harad, this was an invasion that was done in cooperation with the Wainriders. So at the same time that the Haradrim are moving up across the Poros, the Wainriders are moving east along the line of the Ered Lithui. And so this is a great pincher movement, right? We're told that during this campaign, support from Umbar was not available. And as a result of that, was not available to the Haradrim. And as a result of this lack of support, the Haradrim were obliged to march right overland. And they were not getting any support from fleets. Their only option to invade Gondor was to cross the Poros at the one crossing that we know of, and enter Ithilien. And so the strategy from Gondor's point of view was, well, this is going to be easier to defend, right? We know that we're going to be hit from north and south, so we're going to have some defense down here, but we're going to defend like about where the land gets narrower, right? We're told, some 40 miles or so north of the Poros, I think it was. So we have the captain of the southern army. This is Eärnil, who will later become the hero of the Battle of the Camp and will become king, actually the penultimate king of Gondor. Eärnil is disposing his forces without a lot of concern, because he knows that help from Umbar is not available. Now, to say that is very unusual if Gondor were to possess Umbar at that time, right? To say that, the Haradrim cannot expect help from Umbar seems to imply that they don't possess it, right? But it also seems to suggest that Gondor doesn't own it either. So my view, and the view that we've sort of taken from the, I guess internally, although it doesn't appear because all this happens after the starting events of the Wainrider period, but the general view, I think I can fairly say among the developers of the mod is that Gondor probably owned Umbar at the beginning of the Wainrider period, but after that point lost control of it. Who did they lose control of it to is the question. They could have lost it to just, a small breakaway group of Haradrim who was not associated with the northern invasion, right? It would seem to have to be a different group than the invaders, because if the invading group or allies of the invading group possessed Umbar, then why were they not able to help? Well, it could be that the Haradrim are not natural sailors, right? And so maybe they did not have the fleets. So maybe a group of Haradrim owned Umbar at that time, around 1940 of the Third Age, but did not have the shipbuilding know-how to be able to really make use of it. That's a possibility. Another possibility is that the Corsairs, or some of similar groups, had reconquered Umbar at that time, and similarly were in the process of reconstituting their fleets, right? I guess a third possibility is that Gondor had it, but again, that strikes me as strange, because nowhere in the account of the 1944 campaign is mention ever made of needing to defend Umbar. And I would think that with all of this focus on, the territories around Ithilien, defending North Ithilien from the Wainriders and Southern Ithilien from the Haradrim, there would have been some mention of, oh yeah, and we've got to, send some aid to the garrison at Umbar. That's never said. So Umbar seems to have passed out of Gondor's hands by 1944, but we're not told that they lose it before 1850, right? When the Wainriders began their invasion, or 1851, when the Wainriders began to invade Rhovanion. So we're going with Gondor has this outpost in Umbar itself. And the Corsairs, or the descendants of the Corsairs, or the lordship of Umbar, still exist in some way as somewhat of a rump state. So let's jump into the game now, and we'll talk a bit about that and what you can expect to see in the campaign. All right, so here we are in the campaign, the preview campaign, with a look at what Umbar starts with here. Now we've got two settlements. Both of them a little bit north of Umbar, which again is held by Gondor at the start of the campaign. And that's it. The entirety of Harandor is in rebel hands at the start. That will change, as of course Gondor will move down here, and other factions like Harad and the Lost Leden tribes will move in and try to establish themselves there. But that's also something that could be and probably should be a goal of Umbar. But of course, your first goal as this faction would be to take back the settlement that bears your name, right? So how are we imagining this faction? Well, you can see that just from the units, there is a lot of Haradrian influence, especially at the lower tiers. We've got units like Footmen of the Harad, plainsmen skirmishers, mounted skirmishers, as well as spearmen of the Harad as their sort of elite, spear unit. However, there is also an element of Dunedainic stuff, and so let's take a look at that. So here we've got the recruitment. Now again, this is going to be very different in the full mod for Total War Wainriders, but for this preview campaign, we're using sort of the basics that were already there in the new Shadow, and I'm just repurposing them where necessary. But so we've got sort of 4 tiers of barracks, 3 tiers of stables, and then Umbar is going to benefit from a couple of different things. As you can see, they're going to benefit from some development, some specialization buildings, and they're also going to have a bit of a choice in terms of how they align themselves. So let's start with just the basic military stuff. For the preview campaign, at the lower tier, again, you're going to get footmen and skirmishers. At the next level, things are going to get a little more interesting because we're going to have some of the new, well, these are all somewhat new units, retextured at least, but this is a new unit for Wainriders. So these are some mariners, very strong units, javelins and swords, very, very good all around. So very strong. Some archers as well, which again have a great deal of versatility, but not a lot of armor, as you can imagine. So these will be fairly cheap tier 2 stuff versus your much more expensive but stronger tier 2 swords. At the third tier is where you can find your spearmen of the Harad. So, again, a bit of interesting return back to Haradrian sort of influence here. You can imagine that having lived among the Haradrim for a very long time, the lords of Umbar would have known how best to use them, right? As light infantry, as skirmishers, and these spearmen, of course, are very strong, but sort of armed in sort of more a Dunedainic manner. And now at the 4th tier, in your homelands, you're going to have Guards of the Haven. So this is where we get more obviously Dunedainic style units. There are a few more of units that follow this kind of pattern. And so this is a longbow and spear unit, very expensive, very strong, just very solid all around. And these are units you can train in your homelands. The homelands for Gondor, or for Umbar rather, constitute Umbar, as you could imagine, as well as Harondor. So basically any place that has the hidden resource RK, which stands for Reunited Kingdom. Again, this is based on a 4th Age mod. So any place with a hidden resource RK, as well as the hidden resource Harad. So that is essentially the 5 provinces in Harondor, as well as the provinces around Umbar. So those are your homelands, which means that it can be actually a really good move for you to get up here and start colonizing, right? Start establishing yourself, because this is a place you can lay claim to. Even though the heirs of Castamere are gone, we're assuming that there would have been enough lords of Gondor, like royal members of the royal family, even of some minor tiny branch, right? Even of some lesser house of the royal branch. Or just nobles in general from the coasts, from Pelargir, right? These places could have established a great deal of power and influence in Umbar, among the Haradrim, among the other Dunedain. And so they're clinging, we imagine, at this date to the past. They're, bitterly clinging on to this idea that we once had it very briefly, right? We counted amongst our ancestors, our royal line, a king who held Osgiliath for a decade before being compelled to establish ourselves around here. And unfortunately, this has been gone for 16 years. So your first reign of business, of course, your first order of business will be to take it back. But we haven't looked at stables yet. Let's take a look at that. Yes, plainsmen mounted skirmishers, as we've seen. Plainsmen mounted skirmishers, and then a beautiful reimagining of the Scarlet Shields. Again, the units here done by Webbe. Unit cards by Valor for these ones. So this is a mix, right? The Scarlet Shields, if you've played 4th Age Total War, is an excellent unit of Harad. And here we've got a sort of a Dunedainic style or Dunedainic armed unit, but with Haradrian elements and just colors. And I love the color scheme of this faction too, because it's a bit garish. There is this blue, there's the black, there's the gold, there's elements of red in it. It's very colorful. And sort of draws from a lot of these different influences, which you could sort of imagine the Lords of Umbar would. They're establishing themselves down here. It's a different kind of place than the maybe the more characteristic white marbled uniform culture we might imagine of Gondor itself. And maybe I'm misinterpreting that, but regardless, I get the sense that this is a little more of a rambunctious place. Okay, so that's your basic lineup. Now, in addition to that, we've got something I should talk about first is the alignment setup for this faction. So I went back and forth. We've got 3 alignments in the preview campaign here. We've got Ways of Darkness, we've got Ways of the West, and we've got the Shadow Cult, which is essentially the Sauronian influence. Now, the Shadow Cult, I've chosen to limit to the Orcs and to the Wainriders and to Khand. And by the Wainriders, I mean just the 2 Wainrider factions, so the Western Horde, Great Rune, and not the Highland tribes. Khand, those 2 Wainrider factions, and the Orcs are the only factions that can build sort of temples to Sauron, essentially. That seems to make sense to me because Sauron worship, of course, is somewhat of a cornerstone among the Wainriders, or it would have at least been prevalent in the East. And it certainly seems, at least as far as Gondor was concerned, to have constituted a main element of the Wainrider culture. When the Eotheod are chasing the fleeing Wainriders north after the Battle of 1899, the Northmen taunt them, saying, fly east, not north, folk of Sauron. Saying that they've burned their houses. The houses you have stolen are in flames. And so they're referring to the fact that while the 1899 campaign was going on, while the battle was being fought, back at the sort of cornerstone or the homelands of the Wainriders of Rovanion, outlaws had broken out of the forest. Northmen had set alight the camps and the fortified camps of Wains, the settlements, and there was fierce fighting there. So somehow, whether it was by some banners, some kind of insignia, or just a supposition on their part, the Northmen believed that the Wainriders were folk of Sauron. And that seems not terribly unreasonable in some ways, right? I still like the idea that some were not, right? Some were just invading because that was what you do. Some were invading because they had been more, insidiously influenced by agents of Sauron. And we do read, of course, in Appendix A that there were agents of Sauron who brokered a truce and an alliance between the Wainriders, the peoples of Khan, and the peoples of Harad to all coordinate together in that 1944 campaign. So that is why those factions have that Sauronic influence. That left me in a bit of a strange position with regard to Umbar, because there is this tradition of Sauron worship. There is this tradition of, this is the stronghold of the king's men. However, I'm not seeing Sauron worship in these guys. And this is just a feeling, I guess, I've developed over, looking at the sources again and just thinking about it for years here. But I'm not seeing Sauron worship here. I'm seeing that, in a way, the men of Umbar, what's left of them, are somehow too proud to do that, right? They're not seeing themselves as slaves of Sauron. And in fact, Sauron is not said to have been active during the kin strife, to have influenced them at all. I believe at that time he was away in the east. Maybe he was at Dol Guldur, but I think potentially not. Regardless, they were not acting as his explicit pawn during any of this time period. So it seems to me that Ways of Darkness might capture that better. The idea being that these places, that these people are honoring their own traditions. They're not honoring the memory of the Valar. They're not honoring the long forgotten lords of the West. They're honoring their own traditions and sort of turning inward in a way, if that makes sense. So I'm seeing this sort of ultra conservative return to our people, our roots, as that sort of core. So that to me is better represented not by a slavish obedience to Sauron, or kind of loyalty to this distant Dark Lord figure, but to this belief that they themselves can sort of build up their own identity and sort of seize their own power. It seems not too dissimilar from the other traditions of so-called men of darkness, right? Who are, in many cases, when they're fighting Gondor, are simply trying to one up a rival. They're not necessarily trying to conquer in the name of Sauron. They're trying to just be the biggest dog, it seems to me. So anyway, that's the idea there. So we've got, you can establish a monument, an obelisk of Umbar, and a column of Umbar. These latter two, of course, are reminiscent of the Pillar of Pharazôn, and that is a feature you can use in this mod as Umbar, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But so this is sort of the default. So all of your men, let me see if I've set it up right. Yeah, we've got Man of Darkness here. So all of your family members are going to be essentially Men of Darkness. But I've also allowed them to claim membership in the House of Anarion. So I think this is kind of neat. This is also a shortcut for me, so it's less work. I don't have to think of like an imaginary house that could have been represented by the people down in Umbar at the time. But I'm going to say that whoever's leading this ragtag faction at this time is still claiming some membership in the House of Anarion. Now, again, you might think that is strange, but Castamir did this. Castamir claimed membership in the royal house, right? So this seems fitting. And although the heirs of Castamir are dead, there are other men who came from Gondor, other people who were rebels, maybe near to the king in relationship, who came and established themselves in Umbar. There could be others who seized this title, even if it was only a feigned type of thing, where they just pretended. They took on the mantle, right? So that is going to be, essentially the royal house of Umbar is going to be the same as the Royal House of Gondor, the House of Anarion. Of course, this is the family, the royal family, if you're playing as Gondor in this mod as well. Let's talk about the city development. So what are the options you can build here as Umbar? Well, you get 5 different options. So you get actually probably the most of any other faction. And it may seem kind of strange because this is such a weird moment in Umbar's history, right? They've been defeated. They are not even in possession of their titular city anymore. And from here on out, it's only downhill, right? In terms of the lore, these guys become much more known as the Corsairs. After the Kinstrife, Umbar is established as a lordship, and so that's the title we're still using in the mod, the Lordship of Umbar. But after the Wainrider period, they're just referred to as Corsairs. So it seems that there is this kind of degradation or degeneration of Umbar's nobility, or the claims that it made to nobility, right? After this period, they go on raids. They're associated with the men of Harad more and more. There doesn't seem to be any claim of a separate, Numenorian lordship that is sort of proper, dignified, Dunedainic sort of thing. And this is somewhat reflected in the buildings you can build here. Now, the city development, the specialization buildings are not necessarily going to be a feature in the full mod, or at least they're not going to look exactly like this. I used this because this was what was there in the new Shadow, and that's easiest for me to just reflavor these buildings and ensure that I'm not going to have a bunch of mistakes crop up. So this is just an easy thing. But I think some of these are kind of cool. So the first one is a Corsair stronghold. You need a haven, like some kind of a port there. And you can get some Corsair Marauders, which is a type of Corsair ship. You also get experienced Corsairs, which is your sword, your dual wielding cutlass unit that you may remember from 4th Age. These guys are trained at ports, by the way. Let me take a look at those. Let's see, do we have some here? We don't have any built currently, but let's open up the harbor. There we go. So at your first tier, you're getting a Haradrian ship of war, just a basic ship, then a Dromund. But Corsairs of Umbar is the unit you can train, the military unit. And these get experience that increases the further away you get from Umbar itself, to represent the fact that, they've been traveling. At a Corsair stronghold, you get more experienced versions of these guys. At the 3rd tier, what do we get here? More experience, and then just the ship of war and the Dromund. So again, they don't even have Dunedainic style ships anymore. They're compelled to use more and more of these Haradrian style boats, or this new sort of Corsair style ship, which is going to be characteristic of them in the coming millennium. So back to the city development. Corsair stronghold. This is also going to increase trade income. So this is actually a really good move. This is something you could build in your starting settlements. Really, any place that has coastal access could get this building. So it's going to make you more money, and it's going to allow you to get some experienced infantry as well as some nice ships. So a really good option. Another good option, but it's going to require that you go inland a bit, is the Ivory Trade Master. So you need a merchant square and you need the Ivory resource, and this is going to get you a ridiculous trade boost. Let's see, the first place you can access that would be, either of the settlements to your east or southeast. Now, in the base version of the new Shadow, Karas Nan actually starts off with Ivory as part of it. But I removed that. I added, sort of to compensate for the fact that I added Ivory in a couple of other places. In the east, I didn't want to have too much Ivory all over the map, so I took it away from here. So now if you want to make use of the Ivory resource for trade, you need to conquer inland, which kind of makes sense to me. And I also removed it for another reason, and that is that another specialization you get is the Mumakil. Mumakil training ground. So this, of course, allows you to train your own brand of Mumakil as Umbar, which is awesome. It seems somehow fitting. You can sort of see this faction as kind of like a Carthage, or like Pyrrhus of Epirus, if you will, where they've got this strong infantry element. They've got this kind of noble, civilized tradition, right, harkening back to very ancient times. They've got elephants, right? So it seems very kind of fitting and on brand. it's one way in which this mod gets out of what we had envisioned initially as a sort of a late antiquity feel, right? So after the Constantine's conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity, the fall of the Western Empire, essentially, the invasion of the Huns. That period, the period that's really explored in Total War Attila, seemed very fitting and very analogous to what we were trying to do and represent in Wainriders. But as you went into the South, it almost feels like you're going back in time to me. This is how I sort of, to go into the South in Middle-earth is to go back in time, right? Isn't that, even if you look at it from the perspective of the novels, the Shire is more modern, right? They got umbrellas, they got references to clocks, right? They've got this kind of modern, 19th century, British, genteel kind of charm to them. And then that goes away as you go back in time. You go back into the Anglo-Saxon period when you get to Rohan, right? You go back into maybe, antique Roman times when you get into Gondor. And then it would seem to me that you maybe go back even farther in time, so to speak, when you get down to Umbar. Now, I'm not saying literally, but just as a sort of a way of understanding the cultures or finding these modern analogs or these analogs for us to grasp, that seems kind of fitting to me, that Umbar would be much more old-fashioned in a way. Okay, so that's the Mumakil. You get Mumakil, but you have to go inland just as well as you have to go inland for the ivory trade. And that is also interesting because it forces a decision, right? You need ivory for both of these, so which one are you going to go with? So get some ivory, get one for elephants, and get all the rest for money, probably is how I would do it. Then we get a few other options here. Law courts are an interesting one, I think. They boost the lawfulness of the settlement, and they allow the training of more experienced spies, and in coastal Gondor regions, loyal men-at-arms. So the idea behind this building is that it is a bit of an attempt by your lordship of Umbar to portray some legitimacy, right? The idea is that Gondor is not your homeland. Your homeland is Umbar and Harondor. This is the area that you have been fighting over and living in for the past 600 years or so, or more. But Gondor should be a place that you get something from, it seems to me. If Umbar, if you're seeing yourself as a member of the royal line, then it seems that you should go into Gondor rather, and be able to rule as some legitimate, kind of presence. You're a member of the royal house, after all, or at least you're claiming that. And this is one way to do that, to establish law courts in the province. It's going to make it easier for you to rule wherever you're ruling. So this has no requirements. You can build this in Gondor, you can build it in Harad, build it in Rune if you want to. Any place you go, this can be very useful. A holdover from the building that I copied this from was that it allowed better spies. I figured, why not? Let's keep that. We know that Umbar must have had some intelligence. They certainly made use of some intelligence in their campaign, the sack of Pelargir, when they caught the king of Gondor at unawares and managed to kill him. So they've got enough intelligence to be able to coordinate with different forces. And this is something we see even late in the Third Age, actually, about 1,000 years after the Wainrider period. We see the Haradrian fleets, the Corsair fleets, landing in the mouths of the Lefnui and the Eisen rivers, marching far inland to support the rebellion of Wolf. So anyway, that's much later history. But again, there seems to have been some coordination, some military intelligence involved there. So that's part of the law courts. And then finally, the most exciting thing is the thing that you get, which is you get a men-at-arms unit. Now this is based on, if you're curious, the Elvelyn Kinsmen from the Fourth Age Total War Dominion of Men. The Elvelyn Kinsmen is a unit that you could train as the elves if you took, I think it's Anuminas, minus Anor, and possibly Dol Amroth. Certainly the first two, maybe Dol Amroth as well. This was a very cool looking unit, but it's one that I never really got to play around with because my Elven campaigns just never took me in those directions. And it seemed like a shame that I didn't get to play with it, so I put it in here. It's also a unit that looks suitably both Dúnedainic, right? It's got that clear Dúnedainic influence. Very heavily armed, sword and shield, male, but it looks different, right? It doesn't look like every other unit of Gondor. It's got the sort of the winged helmet, but it's a slightly different style. So it seems rather fitting for these sort of newcomers, these people of Umbar who are trying to establish themselves, trying to maybe give rewards, give legitimacy, trying to raise troops in somewhat of a familiar way, but with a bit of a different style and flair. So if you take Dol Amroth, if you take Pelargir, if you take I think Minas Anor counts for this as well, but it's basically a place that's Gondor and a place that has the coast hidden resource. If you take one of those places, you can get these units there, and it'll be very helpful because otherwise Gondor is essentially an outland for you. You don't get a lot of your own stuff. And the last one here, maybe the most controversial one, is the Pikemen Training Grounds. This is only available in your homelands, Harondor and Umbar provinces only, and it allows the training of the only phalanx unit in the mod. No phalanx units are present in 4th Age Total War in any of its occurrences, and this seems to have been because that unit type was seen as either very overpowered or very just tricky to balance right. Maybe it's either completely overpowered or it's very wonky, right? Like it doesn't always work very well. There's just some weirdnesses with the phalanx representation in Rome Total War. So this is an experiment on my part, right? This is not something that you will find in the full Wainriders mod. I like the idea of phalanxes. And so I thought, why not? It might make sense, again, to sort of go back to that Carthaginian, that sort of ancient, maybe even kind of Hellenistic style that we could maybe detect in Umbar with the Mumikil that we're allowing them to have, with this tradition of recruiting men from this interior that are of a different culture, right? Having them fight in their own styles to support this core of heavily armored infantry that's supported by some strong cavalry, which we'll get to in a minute, as well as these pike infantry, these phalanx units. So I like the idea of this. The unit performs fine, I think, in combat. It's basically the Spearmen of the Serpent, but with a phalanx. So like it's these guys, Spearmen of the Harad, but they got longer pikes and they operate like a phalanx. So it's kind of cool to have this unit as the regular Spearmen of the Harad, and then a version of this that has the Sarissa kind of thing, and use them together, because you can have a sort of a looser, more mobile formation in these guys, and then like the core, the sort of the front line, or maybe even just anchoring the flanks with the phalanx units, which of course are super effective from the front, but the units, especially heavily armed Gondorian infantry, can fight their way through those spear points and get into your formation, and then it's a very interesting sort of hack and slash kind of scenario. So I really like how it works, actually. So that's something you can build as a specialization building only in Umbar and Harondor, so only in your homeland. So it's like these provinces. And, it takes a while to get there, because, again, the specialization buildings all require that last tier of developments. They always require the large city. So that means you got to work your population up. Now, in the beginning, you don't have either settlement at large city level. You've got one at minor city, and you are relatively close. Well, no, you're not. You're not even halfway there. So you got a ways to go, and you don't have great growth. So what does that mean? You're going to have to do some stuff. You're going to have to do some stuff like enslaving. You're going to have taxes on low and limit your recruitment. You're going to have to do some disbanding shenanigans, right? Like all the kind of good old Rome Total War vanilla mechanics. Again, a lot of this stuff was not employed in 4th Age Total War, again, for very good reason. And we're also not going to do this in the full Wainriders campaign, because, again, the AI doesn't use it very well. But for the preview campaign, I didn't want to upset the boat too much. I wanted to keep stuff like it was in the new Shadow. And also, I kind of like messing with the population, just myself. So that's the way it's going to work. Okay, what I'd like to do now is let's get the armies together here, and let's actually attack Umbar. Umbar is, of course, it's an important settlement to get. I don't want to take anybody out if I'm bad, I guess. Maybe we'll lower the taxes. You start off losing money. That's the other thing. 1914. Let's get a port. That's going to be very nice. Now, the initial disposition of the alignment here, you can see, is kind of split. There's some old Saronic holdouts, maybe from ancient days, some black Numenorians still hanging around, I guess. We've got a good proportion of men of darkness, but also men of the West. So you can decide, and this is something I didn't emphasize maybe strongly enough here, but you can decide whether to build towards ways of darkness or to pay lip service, essentially, to the line of kings, right? Because this would go back to the kings, Elendil, and maybe even some important steward heroes from the past, right? So you can build either of these, but obviously I would go for ways of darkness. That's what your generals are going to be. And if you get into Gondor, these would be more useful, or just to keep the ones that are already built. So you at least have a choice. So we'll go with the harbor there, the port. It's going to improve money a little bit. I guess herbalist is probably good for the income, and public order is going to improve over time. But let's take the heavy guys out of here. Yep. And I think I'll leave everything else the way it is. We could get some mercenary Southron spears. That would be pretty cost effective. And let's get down here. No new Merc pool, but there's Umbar itself, and I think we can handle this. So let's just pass a couple of turns. Get down. They're probably just going to attack us, but I'll go ahead and build a couple of things. Oh, they're not actually. Okay, so what I can do then is we'll just assault. And we will cheat our way to victory here. So auto win attacker. There we go. We'll do this because there's some other stuff to see in Umbar itself. So a couple of minor things here. So already established here is Memorial of the Kings. This is Dunedainic, and this has a nice happy green face. It's Dunedainic culture. This is established here by the Memorial to the Kings. But if we wanted to, we could destroy it. Now, this would cause a problem for us because currently 20% of our disorder is because of the ways of darkness. But like 60 or 70% would pop up. I think we can absorb it, though, so let's go ahead and do that. We can destroy it, and then we can do this. Now, you could see there that actually I didn't technically need to destroy it because I could have just built up this alongside it, and then eventually it would have overtaken the alignment strength of this, and then that would have I don't know, maybe that would have been a better move. But at any rate, there's that. I don't know if I want to invest in retraining, but we can see we've already got a couple of new units available because there is a harbor here. We can train our Corsairs of Umbar. We already have the infrastructure present to build guards of the haven, and that is because the people of Umbar and the Kingdom of Gondor share these buildings, right? So the military buildings are the same. So if you invade Gondor, you can just take over these military things. So that means we can train a Palace Guard unit. This is unique to Umbar. This is, again, a very, very Dunedainic unit, similar in armament in some ways to the Guards of the Haven, but stronger, like quite a bit stronger in terms of its armor and its defensive skill. Just a very, very fearsome unit. Let's take a look, though, at the stables, because these are going to be different as well. We get our Plainsmen Mounted Skirmishers. We also get Horsemen of the Harn in here. So this is this unit, a good Lancer unit. This is the first one we've really seen. And at Tier 3, we're going to get our Scarlet Shields, right, which is a heavy cav unit, whereas the Horsemen of the Harn are those more light, fast kind of Lancers. But we also get Umbar Knights. So a couple of things about this unit. This is intended as and serves as the bodyguard unit in the full Wainriders campaign. For this preview campaign, I've gone a slightly different direction, and I've made a new unit. I've basically dismounted these guys, and I say I made a new unit. All I did was literally change the text file, so these guys are now dismounted. So this is they have sort of a pole arm, like a lance, and they have a sword as a secondary weapon. So that is the unit that your bodyguard commands, not the cav, but an infantry version that is very similarly armed. But if you take Umbar, you can build Umbar Knights at the highest tier stables. So this is to sort of symbolize to me that this faction is kind of on the outs at the beginning of the campaign. And if you take Umbar back, you can get some nice bonuses. There are going to be some new units you can get that you couldn't get before. There's already some nice infrastructure there typically. And if you build up, you can get this fantastic, essentially cataphract kind of unit. So this is just a wonderful thing. Now I think this also serves as a bodyguard unit, like a recruitable bodyguard, so you can get family members out of this. So it is kind of performing the same role as it does in Wainriders, but it's just initially you have to struggle with your family members being infantry. But I think that's kind of neat because it also makes a nice parallel to the fact that Gondor's bodyguard unit is also infantry. So there's a kind of I don't know, like oppositional parallel there, which I find satisfying. What else can you do in Umbar? Well, you'll notice there is a fourth tier of your memorials. So you get your Monument of Umbar, your Obelisk of Umbar, your Column of Umbar, and then at the fourth tier here, you can rebuild the Pillar of Pharazôn. Now, the history of this is interesting. A lot of this is just lifted from 4th Age Total War, where I had written this a long time ago anyway, so I just kind of retweaked it to make it a little more appropriate here. But yeah, the idea is that this pillar was erected as a memorial back in the Second Age or the early Third Age, or I can't remember exactly when this was built. But it was actually demolished when Sauron's forces took command of Umbar, essentially. Right. So the kings of Gondor, when the coasts of Umbar were yet answerable to Gondor, a great white pillar was set upon a headland. So this is, I guess this is in the Third Age. The pillar was cast down in the chaos of the kin strife. Okay, when Umbar broke away from Gondor's rule. But it may be rebuilt by the rulers of an independent Umbar, Dunedain and Corsair lords, some of whom claim descent from the tall sea kings of old. So that's the idea here. And this gives you not only your alignment conversion, it gives you a little law bonus, and it also gives you some trade bonus because I figure it's like it's like a lighthouse or something. Why not? Maybe it encourages pilgrimage or those types of things. So your economy is very tough initially as Umbar, but obviously if you take your capital back, and since you already have this built all the way to the highest level, you shouldn't have any trouble getting all of this stuff built the way you want it. You can make use of some of these things to start generating a lot of income. So that can be very fun. And then you've sort of got the starting point to a nice little relatively safe corner to establish yourself inland, to start making use of this ivory resource, to start exploiting those inland resources, right? Just like Numenorians like to do. You also want to capture a couple of these rebel settlements, like this one on the headland here, just to get a bit of trade going. But also, it makes a lot of sense to go for Harondor. Now, one interesting thing is that you were not at war with the rebels initially. You are at war with Gondor, but you're not at war with the rebel faction. So as you can see, you are in fact trading with these rebel cities in Harondor. So that's a choice you could make, right? Like you could get Umbar and keep trading with the rebels and maybe build up your economy and only attack other factions like maybe Harad when they start to emerge on your eastern border, or you can get a fleet together and start early attacking Gondor. So a couple of different options there for the faction of Umbar. So I hope you like this look at this I think it's a very interesting faction. It's such a weird hinge moment in their history because from this point on, essentially, they're going to be these, kind of squalid corsairs. There's not a lot of nobility. There's not a lot of sense of, ancient dignity and pride that you might imagine would still be kicking around even some decades after Umbar was lost to the forces of Gondor. So stay tuned for more updates to the mod. We're getting closer and closer to release all the time. I can't wait to get this thing off of my plate and just get it out there so people can start enjoying it and so I can just start enjoying it and not having to worry about, tweaking it. But at any rate, let me know if you have any questions and if there's any other factions you would like to see showcased or are just curious about any other aspect of the mod. let me know in the comments. I'll see you in the next one. Take care until then.